For my continuing series of a Nintendo Fanboy reviews Sega Genesis games, I'm going to be talking about Rocket Knight Adventures. It released back on August 5th, 1993, so roughly about 30 years ago. It was made by Konami by some of the same devs that created 16-bit Contra games like the Alien Wars for the Super Nintendo and Hardcore for the Sega Genesis. Rocket Knight did get a sequel for the Genesis that released a year later, along with an SNES spin-off named after the titular opossum, Sparkster. There was a brief revival back in 2010 when Rocket Knight was released for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC Steam, but nothing really since then. The story follows Sparkster as he works to save Princess Sherry and prevent the Pig Star, being unlocked by the evil Devotinto's empire threatening to destroy Sparkster's world. Seriously, it amazes me the cultural impact that Star Wars had in the 90s, even before the prequel revivals. My first Star Wars movie I saw was the 7th episode, The Force Awakens. Don't worry, I did see episodes 1 through 6 at home afterwards. But even I recognized a bunch of things from the overall series, thanks in part to shows and video games like Tiny Toon Adventures, like the Star Wars themed last level of Buster Bust Loose, Sonic the Hedgehog, Dr. Robotnik's Death Egg, and even Final Fantasy, Biggs and Wedge appearing in multiple games. And admittedly, I'd never heard of Rocket Knight Adventures before following one of my favorite YouTube content creators, Retrobird. He has admitted that it is his favorite game of all time and often features this game in its box and cartridge in a number of his videos. And you notice how I mentioned Buster Bust Loose earlier with my Star Wars Bojazz? That's because Rocket Knight Adventures reminded me a little bit of it. Not just because of them all being anthropomorphized, but also some of the gameplay. Like with the one section of the game where Sparkster has to quickly move through the automatically rolling stage or else he'll get crushed. Other games like this would probably be a Contra Hardcore, maybe like Alien Soldier, or perhaps one of the best comparisons being Gunstar Heroes. These games, though, require weapons management. Rocket Knight Adventures sees Sparkster only going forth with his standard weapon and his boosting rocket. One game series not like this is Sonic the Hedgehog. I've heard of others comparing Sonic games to Rocket Knight Adventures, and I just don't see it. Sonic in general doesn't require as precise platforming and technical skill that's needed in Rocket Knight Adventures. And boy, do you need those skills, because this game is hard. Sparkster himself jumps with one button and attacks with another. Holding down the latter allows Sparkster to speed in any of the 8 directions and attack, though doing so will result him bouncing off of walls if any are present. Levels and bosses later in the game require the use of this technique for both survival and causing damage to said bosses. One problem with this is that sometimes it's hard transitioning from quick movement of a rocket burst to a precise jump. Oftentimes, the momentum causes Sparkster to continue forward in higher speed, which often resulted in me overshooting platforms or areas required to advance the stage and falling to my death. Sparkster himself is granted 8 hearts, but depending on the difficulty level that's selected, enemies will damage him anywhere from half a heart to, holy crap, the entire 8 hearts at once. After I beat the game on easy, you can't hear it, but trust me, I'm air quoting easy, I tried the game on hard. I went into the first level, didn't really notice a difference in how many enemies appeared, but when I was finally unlucky enough to touch one, I immediately lost all 8 hearts, my only life, and gamed over right then and there, since hard doesn't grant any continues. The 4 difficulties of Children's, Easy, Normal, and Hard reduce the amount of lives and continues available to the player the more difficult the mode selected, as well as result in more damage to Sparkster whenever he takes a hit. Regionally, the game's difficulty names are different. The levels I mentioned are different in Japan. They label it as Normal, Hard, Very Hard, and Crazy Hard. Also, while there are some areas in the first part of the game where Sparkster is granted a copious amount of health recovery items like apples and bananas, these do taper off in later stages. There are also a few times during the game that see Sparkster on an auto-running shmups-like style of play. While this is inherently pretty cool, I have a soft spot for shmups even though I suck at them. Since it changes up the gameplay, it keeps the tough difficulty level and then some. Remember how I said earlier there aren't any weapon upgrades? Yep, Sparkster's still got his standard sword projectile weapon in these segments, and that's it. Okay, enough of me complaining about the difficulty. I promise you that if you can get past how tough it is, the game actually is a ton of fun to play. Sparkster controls very smoothly, and I picked up using his rocket boost for both an attack and movement pretty quickly. Like Gunstar Heroes and Alien Soldier, there's a large presence of mini and standard bosses interspersed throughout the entirety of gameplay. These bosses follow their own various unique patterns and generally are pretty fun to play through. The rest of the gameplay is intermixed with action platforming, utilizing the stage's environment or even Sparkster's rockets. Or it's like a shoot-'em-up game, though again without the option to increase firepower. As the game progresses, later stages feel like they press into more bosses than stage gameplay, especially the 7th and final one. The bosses themselves are fairly expressive when, of course, they are alive, or they're quite detailed if they're mechanical, and heck, even some of the mechanical ones can be expressive, and that's indicative of the game's overall charm aesthetically. I'd have to say this is probably one of the most colorful Genesis games I've ever seen, even rivaling the color palettes I've seen on evergreen SNES games. To that end, that's probably one of the many things that impressed me about Rocket Knight Adventures. Sparkster himself is detailed and animated quite well, just like his nemesis Axel Gear that appears throughout the game. Even the little pig guys that appear are expressive, both in anger and especially in defeat. Environments are quite varied, even if it continues to follow the gaming trope of having a water stage, a fire stage, and so on. I can definitely overlook using this trope, as really the game is a product of its time, and honestly, the level of detail present in these are quite impressive. Examples of this includes some of the background and foreground movement in the second stage, precluding more infamous games like Donkey Kong Country Returns doing this back on the Wii, as well as the mirrored effect in the lava on the third stage. The latter was reminiscent to some of the effects done on Castlevania Bloodlines too. The sound effects are fantastic, matching gameplay perfectly. Sparkster's sword attacks feel impactful whenever they hit enemies, Rocket Boost's explosive and powerful whenever hitting bosses, and Sparkster's little howl he makes whenever he dies is cute and hopefully demoralizing for the player enough to prevent hearing it continuously. The music itself is also pretty good and expressive depending on the environment Sparkster finds himself in. The first stage's opening Plains tune promises a wide adventure sprawling forth to him and the player, while later stages in the game have a more techno beat to it, as Sparkster finds himself in futuristic, technological-like levels. Admittedly, no single tune wasn't anything that had me tapping toes like some of the tracks from Streets of Rage 2 or Thunder Force 4, but still, I've heard some games with boring, more ambient music, and this ain't like that. So overall, I'm going to be giving Rocket Knight Adventures a 9 out of 10 SNES controllers. While I wouldn't say this game is Battletoads tough, it is still fairly difficult, even on the easiest difficulty setting. The action and platforming is fun and satisfying, with only a few moments I felt were unfair. Sprites and backgrounds were probably the most colorful I've seen yet on the Sega Genesis, with great sound overall. The worst part of this game is the fact that, as of the making of this video, it is currently not playable on the NSO expansion pack or the Sega Genesis collection on current gen consoles. And this is a real shame too, as the NSO especially has done an absolutely fantastic job of getting some stellar Sega Genesis titles playable on the Nintendo Switch. I'm hoping this game will make an appearance there so current gen players can try this title. I know I'll be playing Sparkster next, so I can see how the SNES handles this type of game. Now, have you played Rocket Knight Adventures or any of Sparkster's other games? Let me know in the comments section below. Also, please like or dislike this video and subscribe for more content. As a guy who has grown up as a Nintendo fanboy, it's been quite an experience playing through these Sega Genesis titles and reviewing them. Now that this, my 10th video in the series, is done, I'll be creating a video sort of collecting my thoughts about the Genesis and its library, as well as the parity between Nintendo and Sega during this era. I hope you'll continue to join me for that as well.